Hey, my friend. Welcome to my channel. I'm so glad you're here. If this is your first visit, please subscribe and share this video with your friends and family. Your support means the world to me. Comment below and tell me what city and country you're tuning in from. I love reading every comment. Let's get started. From the instant Kala came into his life, Mason felt as though a part of his very essence had stepped outside his body and taken form. She became the pulse of his every day, bringing with her a boundless wonder, spontaneous bursts of laughter, and a depth of affection too profound to articulate. She was everything a father could hope for in a child. Their connection had always transcended the ordinary. It wasn't just about routines or responsibilities. They shared an unspoken language. Mason could read her feelings before she ever voiced them. For years, it had been this quiet pact between them. She leaned on him, and he held her steady. Together, they faced life's twists and turns. But something in her gaze had changed lately. There was a silence within her that didn't feel natural, and day by day, that silence seemed to grow. At 16, Kala had always been expressive, sharp-minded, quick to laugh, eager to debate. Even when weighed down by worries, she usually talked them through. But lately, she had begun pulling inward. She'd come through the door and vanish into her room, sidestepping conversation with practiced ease. Mason tried to bridge the growing gap, mentioning old inside jokes, queuing up songs they once belted in the car, but her replies were fleeting, if they came at all. Her eyes would meet his for a flicker of a second before drifting away, as though her thoughts were miles elsewhere. He told himself this was probably part of adolescence. A crush gone wrong, a spat with friends, or the familiar turbulence of teenage years. He reminded himself that change at this age was unpredictable. Still, a quiet ache grew in his chest. Dinner time, once filled with laughter and teasing, now passed in near silence. Kala would eat quickly, murmur something about homework, and retreat. On the rare occasions she sat beside him in the living room, she claimed exhaustion, and when he gently asked if everything was all right, she would smile. But it wasn't her real smile. Mason could tell it was too polished, too rehearsed. He considered asking more directly, wondering if someone had hurt her. A dark fear gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, but he resisted it, afraid of overstepping. He chose to wait, believing she would come to him when ready. But as days turned into weeks, the distance between them only widened, and it was breaking him. One night, long after she'd gone to bed, Mason stood in front of a photo on the mantel, a snapshot of them at the beach, caught mid-laugh. He remembered how sand had clung to her legs, how her sunglasses always tilted off-center, how tightly she had wrapped her arms around him. The memory was vivid and remote all at once. He wondered what had shifted, questioned if he had overlooked signs, if he had stepped back when he should have leaned in. He felt utterly lost. The person he loved more than anything was in pain, and he couldn't find the door to reach her. But he was her father. Even in the dark, even without answers, he knew one thing with certainty. He would not stop trying. Letting Kala drift away was not something he could accept. What he didn't yet know was that the truth was already approaching, and once revealed, it would alter everything. One afternoon, purely by chance, Mason left work earlier than planned. A meeting had been canceled, and he decided to make use of the unexpected time, maybe grab dinner, maybe enjoy a quiet evening. As he stepped out of the car with grocery bags in hand and headed for the house, he caught a sound. It was faint, muffled, but unmistakable. A stifled sob. Kala. Mason let the bags fall and rushed toward the sound. On the front steps, he found her, curled up, her face buried in her arms. Her shoulders trembled with each breath, her crying jagged and strained, like the release of something held in too long. Mason approached gently and asked what had happened. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers twisted nervously, her breath coming in broken patterns as she struggled to find words. Mason didn't push her. He simply stayed close, close enough to offer safety, without pressure. Minutes passed before the sobs began to slow. She lifted her head. Her eyes were puffy, her lips quivered, and there was a depth in her expression that no child should ever wear. And then, finally, she began to speak. It had all begun just a week earlier, she said. She had taken a different route home from school, a small detour she hadn't taken before. That's when she noticed a familiar car, parked along a quiet residential street a few blocks away. Her mother's car. Curious and a bit confused, she walked closer to get a better look. That's when she saw them. Inside, her mother and Mr. Darrow, her teacher. They were kissing. Not a passing kiss, not something fleeting. It was deep, intimate, like two people who had long lived in the shadow of secrecy. Calla froze on the spot, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She said it was as if everything stopped. The man she saw standing in front of her classroom each day, the one who handed out assignments and answered questions, was now wrapped in an embrace with her mother. They were completely absorbed in each other, unaware of the world around them. Jocelyn's fingers gently brushed his face, her gaze warm and familiar, as though this moment had happened many times before. Calla stood frozen, unnoticed, watching, disbelieving, unraveling. Then she ran. The moment she stepped inside the house, she locked herself in her room and didn't emerge again for the rest of the day. Alone, she sat in heavy silence, trying to make sense of everything that had just unfolded. Since learning the truth, she had been consumed by the impossible question of what to do with it. She tried to will it out of existence, as though she could convince herself it was nothing more than a fading nightmare. But every time her eyes met her mother's, something inside her twisted, an ugly mix of hurt, confusion, and anger. And every time she entered her history class, her stomach churned with unease. She felt stained, betrayed, laid bare. But above all, she was scared, terrified of what might follow if she dared to speak, of igniting chaos, of being blamed for unraveling everything. So instead of voicing her pain, she swallowed it. She kept her suffering tucked deep inside, even as it slowly began to eat away at her. Mason sat beside her, listening closely. Every sentence felt like a blow he couldn't deflect. Even so, he didn't look away. He met her eyes with quiet steadiness, even though he was coming apart inside. When her story ended, he gently pulled her into a hug. She collapsed against him, sobbing so violently that her whole body trembled. He held her firmly, feeling the magnitude of the wound she had just laid bare. In that moment, he didn't have a solution, but he knew what she needed to hear. He told her she wasn't alone, that he believed every word, that he would try to make sense of what had happened, and that, no matter what, she was the most important thing in his life. Those simple assurances, softly spoken, eased something in her. For the first time in days, Calla felt like she could breathe again. Mason stayed with her until she drifted into a restless but much-needed sleep. Yet as she slept, Mason lay wide awake, haunted by the woman he thought he knew, the woman he'd built a life with. Now she felt like a stranger. And then there was the teacher, the same one he'd shaken hands with at school functions, whose very presence now felt like an offense. Still, he knew better than to rush to conclusions. He needed something more than instinct. He needed evidence, solid and irrefutable. What he didn't realize yet was just how much this search for truth would upend everything. Not just his marriage to Jocelyn, but the way he related to his daughter, who now depended on him more than ever. By morning, doubt had settled heavily on him. Part of him longed to believe this was all some sort of mistake, a miscommunication, something explainable. But then he remembered Calla's eyes the night before, the rawness in her voice, the way she seemed hollowed out by what she'd said. There was no mistaking her honesty. He needed certainty, cold, hard facts. After dropping Calla off at school, he pulled over a block away and sat still, staring blankly at the dashboard. Then, with a shaking hand, he reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, a childhood friend who had become a private investigator. Mason had never imagined he'd be the kind of man who needed a PI. But life rarely plays out the way we expect. He explained everything he knew, everything he feared, and he asked for complete confidentiality. The investigator didn't ask many questions. He simply said it would take up to a week, maybe less, to get concrete proof. Mason didn't ask about the details, didn't want to know whether surveillance or hidden cameras were involved. He trusted the man's judgment. At this point, he had no choice. The week crawled by. Jocelyn went about her routines, making coffee, folding laundry, asking casually about dinner. But Mason could barely look her in the eye. Her movements seemed too polished, her smiles rehearsed. He responded with calmness he didn't feel. He hardly slept. His appetite disappeared. Every time he looked at Calla, his heart ached with a mix of grief and admiration. She had carried a burden no teenager should have to bear, and yet she remained silent. Her quiet strength told him more about her than any words could have. Then, on the 7th day, a message arrived from the investigator. "I've got everything. When can we meet?" Mason's chest tightened. That evening, he drove to the investigator's home. There, he was handed an envelope. Inside were printed photographs and a flash drive. The very first image knocked the breath out of him. Jocelyn, hand in hand with Professor Darrow, walking into a cheap motel on a weekday afternoon, both of them smiling. Other images followed: meetings in quiet cafes, embraces in parked cars, small touches that betrayed familiarity, all time-stamped to coincide with her claimed work appointments. It was all there, blatant, icy, unmistakable. Mason said little. He paid the fee and left, numb to the world. He couldn't tell which feeling was winning, rage or heartbreak. Back home, Jocelyn was curled up on the couch, watching a sitcom. He walked past her in silence, climbed the stairs, took a long, scalding shower, then threw on the first shirt he could find. Coming back down, he held the envelope in his hand. Without a word, he sat across from her and passed it over. She opened it. By the third photo, her eyes welled with tears. Her hands trembled. She tried to speak, but the words faltered and fell apart. Eventually, something came out, a half apology, half justification. She said she'd felt alone, that Mason had been distant, too consumed by work, by everything else. She needed a listener. He had appeared without warning, right when she felt invisible to the world. The professor didn't speak. He remained still, observing quietly. And as each word poured out of her, Mason realized the woman before him no longer felt familiar. The woman he had once loved, the mother of his child, now seemed like a stranger. As she continued speaking, Calla emerged from the hallway. She halted, catching every word her mother said. Silent and unmoving, she stood frozen, wide-eyed. That single look from Calla shattered Jocelyn. She tried to approach her daughter, but Calla stepped back. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she told her mother she didn't want to hear another word. Without hesitation, she turned and walked upstairs. She never looked back. The silence left behind was suffocating. Mason kept his composure on the outside, but inside, everything was collapsing. His face remained still, unreadable, but turmoil raged beneath the surface. Then he spoke, his voice quiet and composed. "You destroyed this family for your own reasons. Instead of coming to me, you chose deceit and betrayal. And the worst part..." He paused, emotion tightening his throat. "You dragged our daughter into this mess." He didn't raise his voice. His words came slowly, deliberately, full of sorrow rather than rage. His expression wasn't one of fury, but of deep, irreparable disappointment. "I never claimed to be without faults, but I was always here. You threw that away like it was worthless. He stood from the couch then, motioning toward the door. He didn't yell. He didn't plead. It was simply the end. Jocelyn didn't resist. She understood. This wasn't just the unraveling of a relationship, it was the breaking of their daughter's trust. In silence, she walked to the bedroom, packed a few essentials into a bag, grabbed the car keys, and left. Mason remained seated, unmoving, eyes fixed on an unopened envelope that sat forgotten on the table. Later that night, Calla came downstairs for a drink of water. She found her father still there, unmoved, the television dark and silent. She walked over and gently rested her head on his shoulder. They stayed like that, wordless, together. For the first time since everything fell apart, the silence felt different. The hurt hadn't vanished, the questions hadn't gone, but in that quiet, there was connection, and that meant something. 2 days after Jocelyn's departure, Mason woke up with renewed clarity. The image of the professor, woven into the chaos of his family's breakdown, lingered relentlessly. Calla's stunned expression from that night haunted him. It burned in his memory. He reached for the folder containing the photos and the report, took a deep breath, and turned on his computer. He wrote an email that was simple and factual, no emotion, no embellishments. He addressed it to the school's leadership, attached the necessary documents, outlined what had happened, and formally requested an investigation. He ended with a firm statement. As a father, he couldn't stand by while a teacher engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a student's parent, compromising the school's integrity. Pressing send lifted something heavy from his chest. This wasn't about revenge. It was about doing the right thing, for Calla, for himself. The reply came quickly. That afternoon, a school coordinator reached out. She thanked him for the thorough information, confirmed receipt, and informed him that Professor Darrow had been suspended pending a formal investigation. 2 days after that, another email arrived. This one official. Darrow had been terminated due to violations of the school's ethical policies. The administration pledged to conduct a full internal review and reaffirmed its commitment to student welfare and professional standards. Mason read the message without a smile, but a sense of resolution settled over him. The betrayal still hurt, but taking action had mattered, not to erase the past, but to prevent harm from continuing, for Calla's future. She learned about Darrow's firing through a classmate. The link had started circulating in parents' groups, and someone shared it. She read it in silence, her face unreadable. Then she walked to her father and asked if he had done it. Mason didn't deny it. He told her he had. He explained it was because she deserved to feel safe in her school, because he had a responsibility as her father, and because her well-being was his priority above all else. She hugged him tightly without saying a word. It was the first time in weeks she had embraced him freely. For Mason, that quiet moment spoke volumes more than anything she could have said. In the days that followed, the house began to settle into a new rhythm. The silence lingered, but it had changed. Where it once felt cold and filled with tension, now it was peaceful, almost soothing. Mason adjusted his schedule to drive Calla to and from school each day. In the evenings, they cooked meals together. Some were disasters, others turned out well, but they laughed regardless. Slowly, they started creating something new. It didn't resemble what they once had, but it was honest. It was theirs, and that was enough. It started with the smallest signs of healing. Calla had begun to emerge from her shell, speaking more freely about her dreams. One afternoon, she even mentioned a writing contest she was considering entering. The prompt was, "What defines courage?" And she thought she might have something important to say. Soon after, the divorce unfolded, quietly, without confrontation. Jocelyn, subdued and already worn down by guilt, chose not to contest anything that might spark further tension. She insisted that Calla and Mason should keep the house, saying she couldn't bear to take away the only place her daughter had ever truly called home. Instead, she opted to keep the modest apartment they had once purchased as an investment. It would, she said, be enough for her to begin a new chapter. Mason agreed, not out of generosity, but from a belief that endings should be handled with dignity. As for Professor Darrow, he faded from Jocelyn's life completely. In the aftermath of it all, no institution was willing to bring him on. He left the area in search of a fresh start, hoping that somewhere his past wouldn't follow. All of them emerged from the wreckage changed, but only a few fully grasped the depth of what had been lost. Jocelyn made several efforts to reconnect. She sent messages, asking if they could talk. Mason always responded with civility, but kept his distance. He told her that any future communication should be via email, and only if it involved Calla. Calla, on the other hand, remained wordless. She read every note her mother sent, but never replied. The images she carried from that night remained too sharp, too painful. Forgiveness wasn't something she could force. It was a road she hadn't yet stepped onto. Mason didn't try to push her. He honored her silence, letting her come to terms with it in her own time. He knew that urging her to move on before she was ready might cause more harm than good. Time passed, and slowly, healing took root. Then one afternoon, seemingly out of nowhere, Calla returned from school with an envelope in her hands. It was a letter announcing that she'd won. Her essay had taken first place in the competition. She had written about a father who became her anchor when everything else fell apart. A man who never raised his voice, who stood by what was right, and who remained calm as their world fractured. Mason read her words at the kitchen table, eyes glassy with tears. Calla stood a few steps away, quietly watching. When he reached the final line, he looked up and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "You saved me too." In that moment, they both understood something profound. What they had built together was stronger than the pain they'd endured. Because when truth is met with courage, even the deepest hurt can become a source of strength, and betrayal can give rise to something unshakable. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you like this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel. I'll say goodbye until the next video. See you.